stick with what I've written because I don't want to get into some trouble or some microaggression. Ridiculous. Okay. I know that some of you may not feel really excited about the idea of a paper on economic history. But fear not, my friends, I'm still a follower of the Austrian school. Therefore, I shall spare you quantitative analysis or graphs or projections of GDP outcomes or outputs. Just like these tools tell us little about future economic performance, they tell us next to nothing about the causes behind the actions and economic spirit of people living in the past. What I wish to do today is simply to offer an outline of the commercial revolution that took place in Europe during the Middle Ages. And the reason why I wish to do this is that this dramatic change in the history of Europe is very much forgotten. The expression European miracle has come to indicate a historic and unprecedented growth in the per capita economic output and in the living standards experienced by our continent in the last 4 or 5 centuries. The Industrial Revolution has arguably been the most spectacular moment in this economic growth. But while we instinctively associate economic development with the Industrial Revolution, there had already been a longer, though less abrupt, economic expansion, and industrialization itself did not come into existence out of thin air with no savings from earlier generations or in a cultural vacuum. To the contrary, the economic history of Europe cannot be understood without considering earlier long-term phenomena such as institutional developments and value systems. Now, perhaps this earlier history was not unique to Europe, or maybe it was, but that's a debate I don't wish to get into today. What's important is that whether unique or not, the merchant capitalism of the Middle Ages was a necessary stage for the later phase of industrial capitalism. In other words, the medieval period, far from being an insignificant and dark age, elaborated new mercantile praxis, banking systems, legal instruments, technological and maritime tools, and an entrepreneurial mentality that we should not take for granted. The commercial revolution, which was just mentioned by Rick, lasting roughly from the 11th to the 15th century, was a period when different European peoples and polities experienced an economic revival, characterized by long-distance trade and urbanization. In order to appreciate this splendid medieval revival of trade and the rebirth of cities, first, we have to briefly consider what was the situation in Western Europe, or better, in Latin Christendom, before these changes. After the barbarian invasions and the disintegration of the Roman Empire in the West, late antiquity and the very early Middle Ages were characterized by negative economic and social trends, some of which had actually started during the last centuries of the Roman Empire and were due to increased fiscal pressure and militarization. Some of the trends that we see are the following: depopulation and deurbanization, the decline of long-distance trade, the loss of North African grain supplies, the emergence of a simple subsistence economy, ruralization, and the rise of a demesne system where each demesne or manor was producing foodstuff for itself. Finally, the misleading presence of town markets which were actually very small and local. These town markets and the artisans and peasants visiting them did not have access to foreign markets and therefore did not take part in any significant division of labor. So to summarize these trends, they mark what some historians have called a radical material simplification. Now, the picture that I gave you, one of a sudden catastrophe striking the Western Empire between the 5th and the 6th century, is actually not entirely correct. Some historians have stressed continuity, pointing out, for instance, that ports like Marseille continued to engage in long-distance trade, and even after the fall of the empire in the West, thanks to colonies of Jew and Syrian merchants. These historians do not deny that a catastrophic event bringing about the end of trade and the impoverishment of Latin Christendom happened. Rather, they moved the date later. The disaster was not brought by the barbarian invasions of the 5th century, but instead by the Islamic invasions of the 7th and 8th century. This thesis, originally proposed by Henry P. Wren, has been recently indirectly confirmed by archaeological evidence described by Sean Kingsley, for instance, and it has been revived and defended by Professor Dario Fernandez Morera. It is not my intention here to engage with this debate. We can say that the economic decline happened in the 5th century because of Germanic invasions, or we can say that it took place in the 7th and 8th centuries when Latin Christendom was put under siege by Islam and the Mediterranean became an Islamic lake. For the limited scope of my paper, what matters is that by the 9th century, Latin Christendom was a rural, agricultural, de-urbanized economy with very little trade, very little division of labor, no fluid capital, and no foreign markets. It was cut off from Eastern Christendom and Constantinople. It had no significant fleets, and it did not have anything resembling an entrepreneurial culture. So now that we have established this historical background, we can finally look at the commercial revolution itself. The earliest traces of an increase in agricultural productivity, itself one of the preconditions for the rise of commercialized agriculture, are apparent in the 10th century. Robert Lopez has demonstrated how in an economy where manpower is still an essential asset, the cycle of economic simplification initiated by demographic decline could be broken by diversification of production and land reclamation only after the appearance of a timid but significant demographic growth. Population growth is exactly what we see from the 9th century, so that by the 10th century, various areas of Latin Christendom experienced different techniques and strategies to increase productivity. For example, in northern Italy, England, and Scandinavia, the 10th and the 11th centuries witnessed agricultural expansion and redevelopment. From the 10th century, we also see land leases and contracts, putting more farmers to work on lands that had never been used before. In Scandinavia, farmers took advantage of climate change to go beyond subsistence agriculture. These changes in the countryside happened often thanks to monasteries, which copied manuals for farming and led the efforts to clear lands. But the extraordinary role played by Christian monks didn't just lead the extraordinary role played by Christian monks was multifaceted, and it would itself deserve a paper. They didn't simply lead the effort in terms of clearing land. They also introduced industries and production methods, from cheese making in Parma to large-scale iron production in England and France. And perhaps more importantly, Christian monasticism assigned unprecedented dignity and spiritual significance to manual labor. As a result, the development of markets around monasteries preceded the significant revival of long-distance trade by several centuries. Something else was going on during the 10th century and the 11th century. After all, an expansion of cultivated areas achieved thanks to a growing population is not enough by itself to offer a meaningful amount of agricultural surplus and to initiate a process of reorganization. Other factors must have played a role. Here, it is important to consider institutional changes and the industriousness of medieval society. Because of late Roman institutions such as the voluntary colonnade, and because of the multiform influence of the church, between the 5th century and the 10th, the Roman slave was transformed into the European peasant, initially often still unfree, in the sense that he was denied freedom of movement by the institution of serfdom. But at any rate, in the manorial system, where the peasant had land of his own, a house of his own, hereditable in his family, and he could not be bought or sold, the lord of a manor had an incentive to find a more systematic exploitation of resources on all of his lands and to discover more effective ways to use the labor of his farmers. While the peasants themselves, on their own plots of land, would be incentivized to try to produce as much as possible. Therefore, both lords and peasants sought, experimented, and regularly used both agricultural tools and strategies to increase their yields. In other words, the increase in agricultural productivity taking place in various areas of Christendom from the 10th century was the result of both a more systematic rotation of crops and a more widespread use of tools such as water mills, windmills, and heavy plow. I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, but Kirk can correct me here. The combination of these factors, the fruit of human action and ingenuity at the local level, in many areas, brought agricultural surplus to meaningful levels and caused a movement from self-centered manors to commercialized agriculture. Now that we have dealt with the preconditions for a commercial revolution, we can move to trade itself. The first signs of a revival of trade also appeared in the 10th century, in the Flanders and in Venice. Immediately we see a diversity of paths towards merchant capitalism and the utter lack of any all-encompassing political power orchestrating or coordinating this revival across the continent. In the Flanders, mercantile activities were favored by the geographic position of the region, but also by a tradition of leather industry and cloth making that was further stimulated by the construction of fortresses in Ghent and Bruges. On the other hand, in Venice, trade had survived out of necessity, but also because of the ingenuity of the Venetian people, who had initially specialized in the production of salt and wine glass, and who continued to maintain contacts with Constantinople. In other words, in the 10th century, Venice was better positioned to both regain access to foreign markets and to accumulate savings used by some families to fund shipping and voyages to Greece. In this context, the first insurance contracts appear and Venetian ships begin to trade Eastern goods like spices and silk. By the 11th century, this spontaneous and varied process is taking place in different polities, and everywhere we see different roads to economic and urban revolt. For instance, Genoa had no contacts with Constantinople, no agrarian surplus, and surely no local industry. In fact, at the beginning of the 10th century, Genoa is little more than a fishing village cut off from the rest of northern Italy, with very limited natural resources and with almost no fertile land in its mountainous countryside. Yet, partly as a response to the attacks of Muslim pirates who in 935 destroyed the town and enslaved a considerable portion of the population, the local aristocracy of Genoa became involved in shipbuilding and naval warfare. Very quickly, a small town of which we know next to nothing for the late Roman and early medieval period becomes a large city, a maritime republic, and the metropolis of an intercontinental network of commercial colonies. Everything started with a Genoese counterattack against Islamic outposts. From here, Genoa moved to establish a key alliance with the town of Pisa. Then privateering and naval warfare against Islamic fleets rapidly started to coexist with investment in clothes, imports of grain, and long-distance trade. This in turn attracted people from the countryside to a city that was now able to both feed and employ a larger labor force. The example of Genoa brings me to mention the role played by the First Crusade. This unprecedented call to arms shook the societies of Latin Christendom, but it also had consequences for Genoa, Pisa, and of course Venice. The fleets from these cities carried troops to the Holy Land, but more importantly, they reopened the Mediterranean to European shipbuilding. To European shipping. Merchants from Latin Christendom were now once again in regular contact with the Byzantine Empire, and even after the fall of the Crusader states, European long-distance trade continued to expand. Equally important is the fact that in northern Italy, the private armies of cities scored key military victories against territorial lords and emperors. In the meantime, the integration of markets and specialization across Latin Christendom continued. For example, in the 13th century, Italian ships reopened the maritime route from the Mediterranean to England and Holland. And even before that, merchants from northern Spain started to regularly trade with Southampton and London. The reorganization of Christendom during the commercial revolution was spectacular. Many old Roman cities had been somehow kept in existence by the bishops, even during the most dramatic period of economic decline. Where a bishop resided, there were a cathedral church and a school. Often, there was also an ecclesiastical court, something that would later offer merchants a judicial service. Sometimes bishops even had mints and took care of local roads and retails for bridges and basic infrastructures. From the 11th century, a commercialized agriculture and the revival of long-distance trade made reurbanization at first conceivable and then unstoppable. Once isolated manors and market towns were now connected, and a broader and deeper division of labor could take place. Foodstuff will travel from further away, or it could feed more people coming from other areas and attracted by the schools and shops and new professions emerging in the cities. Between the 11th century and the 14th, the population of Milan and Venice rose from less than 20,000 to more than 100,000 each. From the late 11th century, brick and stone private tower houses were built in Parma, Bologna, Pisa, Genoa, and countless other Italian towns. In some areas, the growth of urban centers was accompanied by the appearance of merchant guilds. Once again, we notice a lack of uniformity, because while all merchant guilds contributed to the development of private arbitration and plural jurisdictions, English guilds tended to be also economic monopolies, regulating the retail of certain goods within a town. While most merchant guilds in Germany and the Low Countries had no such powers and were basically voluntary groups of mutual assistance in long-distance travel. These changes in the economic life of many cities were also due to a change in the value system of Latin Christendom. Roman societies had an incredibly negative attitude towards commerce. Merchants were despised, and trade was seen almost as an immoral way to get rich. By the 11th century, we already see the first signs of a change in the attitude of medieval society towards commerce. As I have already mentioned, that around that time, even noblemen in Genoa started to invest funds in shipbuilding and trade. I don't have the time to get into any detail, but by the late Middle Ages, Italian towns will pride themselves on having the best merchants and businessmen, while private wealth seems enfranchised and celebrated. These changes are in turn linked to the appearance of professional merchants and to the availability of credit, together with an acceptance of mercantile activities. These two factors will make the commercial revolution much more than a mere recovery of Roman economic patterns. Crucially, the figure of professional merchant and the expansion of credit are responsible for experiments in institutions that will later be taken for granted. For example, double-entry bookkeeping, merchant manuals, and agents representing companies in distant markets. Concerning credit, we should remember the great medieval fairs, the already mentioned idea of insurance for risky long voyages, and the contagious spread of notarial tools that allowed even captains or single sailors to lend or borrow money to engage in commerce and trade. This development of commercial contracts is crucial. They included documents detailing the instructions given to agents selling goods in foreign markets, short-term and long-term partnerships, and complex sea loans, bringing together different parties cooperating in mutually beneficial money lending and transportation of goods. During the commercial revolution, the Roman institution of procuratio was transformed by Italian merchants and notaries into a flexible tool, which empowered the procurator, the agent, not only to collect credit from debtors in distant markets, but often also to immediately reinvest those funds into merchandise. Sometimes the procurator was even given the power to sign legally binding partnerships with third parties. Not by chance, a procurator with such plena potestas, full power, was usually a brother or a close relative, which goes back to the issue of trust. Genoese notaries, in particular, experimented innovative legal frameworks to favor long-distance trade and investment while putting a limit to the dangers of unlimited liability. But these legal tools that we take for granted for the early modern and modern period were being adjusted, tested, and spread across medieval Christendom, including French markets like Marseille, Montpellier, and Toulouse. Foreign merchants of various origins are always present in the notarial archives and business letters from this period. French, Catalan, and Italian merchants shared a basic legal and entrepreneurial culture as well as some language. Notaries facilitated cooperation and devised transnational contractual tools. While this was achieved without any overseeing political or jurisdictional authority encompassing all the territories in question. One last point on medieval innovations concerning credit. Much has been written about the appearance of secondary bond markets, and I have written something about this myself, as well as about the role played by the state in so-called financial revolutions from the 16th century. However, not enough attention has been given to fundamental changes in the private capital market at the local level, which preceded early modern and state-centered financial expansions. Thankfully, the efficiency of late medieval private microcredit in places like the Low Countries has recently been the subject of some research. For example, Van Zanden and others have shown that property rights in Holland were clear enough to allow for the emergence of capital markets, at least since the 14th century. The strength of private property rights in some areas of the Low Countries originated from the earlier agricultural expansion that I described earlier, and in particular from the phase of that agricultural expansion during the 11th to 13th centuries, and from the freedoms and rights that lords had to offer to attract potential participants in land reclamation. So the increase in agricultural output, the development of credit and contractual tools, the emergence of powerful fleets, and the restless business culture of medieval Christendom soon brought European merchants to establish more regular and profitable trading relations with the Islamic world. Christian-Muslim trade had never completely disappeared, but it had been hampered not merely by religious divisions, but especially by the slower economic development of Latin Christendom at the beginning of this period due to the late Roman crisis. This started to change during the commercial revolution. Italian merchants bought spices and alum in Egypt, but they also sold woolen and linen cloth. And they inserted themselves in the trade flows between Alexandria and Constantinople. In this sense, the Crusades simply consolidated a position previously acquired by Genoese peasants and Venetians in the commerce between Egypt and Constantinople. As early as 1082, Venetian merchants had fiscal exemptions and other privileges in Constantinople. This pattern will be repeated by other Italian merchants in colonies across the Mediterranean world. Medieval entrepreneurship continued to fuel this expansion of trade in the Levant. According to David Jacobi, from 1192, Byzantine and Egyptian merchants must have increasingly relied upon Italian transportation services. And from the 12th century, Latin Christians were even selling ships to the Egyptians. Overall, Western Europe was ready to take advantage of both the decline of Constantinople following the Fourth Crusade in 1204 and the access to Asian goods now available around the Black Sea thanks to the relative stability brought by the Mongol Empire across Eurasian land routes. I just want to add in passing a reference to an ancillary of trade. That is cartography. Cartography was one of the most developed disciplines in late medieval Europe, especially if we consider the portolans, which were extraordinarily precise navigational charts developed in conjunction by pilots and map makers to detail the features of ports and coastal areas. For Catalan and Italian merchants, maritime routes were a fundamental and invaluable information, and paradoxically secrecy and ruthless competition gave them the incentive and the intellectual means to transform new geographic experiences into a systematic body of knowledge. The rational systematization of navigational experiences is evident, for instance, if you look at the Catalan Atlas, one of the most beautiful maps produced in medieval Christendom. We don't really hear much about the splendor of medieval cartography usually. The presence of alternative paths to commercialization, urbanization, and trade across Christendom does not mean that different revivals were not intertwined. That will be the opposite of what I'm trying to describe here, because every step towards prosperity is in a sense a step towards a greater division of labor and integration of markets. But these entanglements took form in a spontaneous way, without a state or a superstate directing flows of goods and capital. Also, without a centralized legislation or a monopoly of jurisdiction. In fact, medieval Christendom owes its greatness, above all, to its plurality and competition of jurisdictions, coupled with value systems that, at least in theory, respected and celebrated private property rights by placing them in the realm of natural law, so beyond the reach of the state. Local identities, reciprocal and contractual relations, and the proliferation of jurisdictionally autonomous institutions like universities and guilds rendered the medieval period one of the most important for the history of rights, as suggested, for instance, in many books and articles by Brian Tierney. If to this proliferation of rights claims, without the boundaries of the modern state, we add the broad spiritual and cultural unity given to medieval civilization by Christianity, we can quickly guess why the Middle Ages are not very popular among modernists. In conclusion, the result of this medieval commercial revolution was not merely a recovery of the Roman economy and of its levels of productivity before the crisis. Instead, medieval civilization produced a better, more dynamic economy than that of ancient Rome. A medieval economy characterized by a more widespread use of technology, by novel, modern business practices and mercantile institutions, and by private capital and sophisticated legal tools. Most importantly, Latin Christendom experienced, at least in some urban areas, a cultural movement away from the typically negative judgments against trade and merchants. Obviously, I could only offer a brief reflection today on a complex topic. More caveats and more case studies should be added, but a couple of general points should be clear, and hopefully they have been worth of your attention. First point, the commercial revolution was led by private interests, initially in the manorial economy, where a non-free peasantry was put to work to clear lands, and itself became acquainted with new agricultural tools and strategies bringing surplus. Then, with the decline of manorialism in the lands cleared by free peasants, and in the cities where long-distance trade and mercantile values flourished. These medieval economic developments were not the result of a deliberate plan by any national or continental political power. As observed by David Nicholas, and I quote, "Political decentralization fostered the interdependence of regional economies that is so essential to the exchange of goods and services that are the reason for the city's existence." End of quote. This is in line with what we know from sound Austrian economics, and it contradicts historians obsessed with state capacity. Second point, as recently pointed out by Professor Hans Hermann Hoppe, medieval civilization is worth studying. The commercial revolution is only one of the great inheritances that an ungrateful modernity has received from Latin Christendom. Thank you.
We start again at, I think, 2 o'clock sharp. In the meantime, there's lunch.